Margaret Hayes moved her mop across the polished marble floors of the Thornwood Chess Club, her worn gray uniform nearly blending into the shadows of the exclusive Manhattan establishment. When she paused to watch a game, the club's newest star, James Hartford, noticed her with a condescending smirk. The young Grandmaster, fresh from his national championship victory, made a show of offering the janitor a chess lesson, his expensive suit and arrogant laugh drawing a crowd of amused members. They recorded on their phones as he patronized her, assuming this simple cleaning woman had never touched a chess piece in her life. He had no idea who she really was. He never saw it coming. What happened next would not only humiliate him in front of everyone, but send shockwaves through the entire chess world, turning a moment of cruelty into a lesson none of them would ever forget. The Thornwood Chess Club occupied the entire third floor of a pre-war building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where old money and new ambition converged over 64 squares of checkered possibility. From the moment the private elevator doors opened, visitors entered a world of deliberate opulence. The floors were Italian marble, veined with gold that caught the light from crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls from the coffered ceiling. Every piece of furniture was mahogany, hand-carved and polished to a mirror shine, from the massive tables holding chess sets, with pieces carved from ivory and ebony, to the leather armchairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The walls were lined with gilt-framed portraits of chess legends, their serious faces gazing down at the players below. Kasparov, Fischer, Carlsen, Polgár, names that carried weight in this rarified world. Membership required not just money but connections, a waiting list that stretched years long, and an annual fee that could fund a comfortable life elsewhere. This was not a place for casual players. This was where champions were made, where masters studied, where the elite of the chess world gathered to test themselves against equals. The air itself seemed heavy with expectation and privilege, scented with leather, old wood, and the faint aroma of expensive coffee from the club's private cafe. In this temple of intellect and status, Margaret Hayes pushed her cleaning cart with quiet efficiency, as invisible as the air the members breathed. At 52 years old, she had worked as the evening janitor for 3 months, arriving each night at 7 when the dinner games began, and leaving at midnight after the last members departed. Her gray uniform was simple, worn soft from industrial washing, her name embroidered in faded blue thread over her heart. She moved through the grand halls with a calm demeanor, her weathered hands guiding the mop in smooth, practiced strokes, her cleaning supplies organized with methodical precision. But while the wealthy members saw only a cleaning woman, someone beneath notice, anyone who looked closely at Margaret's eyes would have seen something different. They were sharp, observant, missing nothing as they swept across the boards and players. Those eyes held depths the club members never bothered to explore, watching each game with an intensity that suggested understanding far beyond what anyone would expect from a janitor mopping their floors. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. James Hartford was 28 years old and had the world at his feet, or so he believed. He had been crowned national chess champion just 6 weeks earlier, and he wore that title like his tailored Italian suit, perfectly fitted and impossible to miss. The suit was charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes cut to emphasize his athletic frame, paired with a crisp white shirt and his signature burgundy silk tie that had become his trademark in tournament photographs. His watch was a Patek Philippe, the kind that cost more than a luxury car, and it caught the light as he gestured expansively while holding court at one of the club's central tables. A small crowd had gathered around him, fellow members and aspiring players who hung on his every word as he recounted his championship match. His voice carried across the hall with practiced confidence, the swagger of someone who had tasted victory and found it sweet. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle crossed over his knee, completely at ease in his domain. The final game was almost disappointing, James said, straightening his silk tie with a practiced motion that had become habit whenever he made a point he considered particularly clever. Petrov saw the combination coming 3 moves too late. At that level, 3 moves might as well be 3 years. The admirers laughed appreciatively. An older member, trying to flatter, asked about his preparation strategy. James smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Preparation is everything, of course, but natural talent separates the good from the great. Some people are simply born with the ability to see patterns others cannot. It's not something that can be taught to just anyone. He straightened his tie again, punctuating his superiority. You either have the mind for chess at the highest level, or you don't. Breeding and education matter. Intelligence matters. Not everyone is capable of understanding the game the way champions do. The group nodded solemnly, as if he had shared profound wisdom rather than thinly veiled arrogance. Margaret cleaned the nearby tables, her movements economical and unobtrusive. She wiped down a surface not 15 feet from where James pontificated, but he never glanced her direction. To him, she was simply part of the furniture. Background noise in his moment of glory. Her cart squeaked slightly as she moved to the next table, but the sound disappeared beneath James's confident laughter and the murmurs of his admirers. She was invisible, beneath notice, exactly as James preferred anyone he considered common to be. 2 nights later, Margaret was cleaning the west wing of the club when she paused near a game in progress. 2 senior members were deep into a complex middle game, their pieces locked in a tense battle for control of the center. Margaret's hands stilled on her mop handle, her eyes tracking the position with an intensity that transformed her face for just a moment. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, her gaze moving across the board with the kind of focus that suggested she was seeing not just the current position, but the possibilities branching out from it like a tree. James noticed her from across the hall. He had been discussing opening theory with a small group when his eyes landed on the cleaning woman staring at the chessboard. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that preceded cruelty. He leaned toward his companions and spoke just loudly enough for his voice to carry. Look at that. The help is fascinated by our little game. I suppose it must seem like magic to people like her, watching pieces move across a board without understanding any of it. The members around him chuckled, glancing over at Margaret. One younger man, eager to impress James, added his own comment. Probably thinks it's checkers. The laughter grew louder. James straightened his burgundy tie, warming to his theme. It's rather like watching a dog observe a piano recital. Curious about the sounds, but utterly incapable of comprehending the complexity behind them. Some things simply require a level of education and breeding that not everyone possesses. Margaret heard every word. The marble halls carried sound with perfect clarity, but she did not turn, did not react, did not give them the satisfaction of knowing their words had reached her. Instead, she simply resumed her work, her movements as calm and measured as before. She guided her mop across the floor with steady strokes, her face composed, her dignity intact despite the mockery. She had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting, that silence could be its own form of strength. The laughter continued behind her as she worked her way toward the storage closet. But as she turned the corner, a young woman in a crisp white shirt and black vest appeared, carrying a tray of empty glasses. Sarah Chen was 24 years old, a junior employee who worked the evening shift managing member services. Her face lit up when she saw Margaret. "Good evening, Mrs. Hayes," Sarah said warmly, her voice genuine and respectful. "How are you tonight?" Margaret's expression softened. "I'm well, Sarah. Thank you for asking. And yourself?" They spoke for a moment, a brief exchange about Sarah's college classes and Margaret's daughter. Sarah treated Margaret like a person, not a uniform. And the contrast with the dismissiveness of the members could not have been starker. When they parted, Sarah touched Margaret's arm gently. A small gesture of solidarity that Margaret appreciated more than the young woman knew. Over the following 2 weeks, Margaret's routine became a source of entertainment for James and his growing circle of admirers. Each evening when she arrived, she moved through her duties with the same quiet efficiency, but inevitably, her path would cross with games in progress, and she would pause, sometimes for just a few seconds, sometimes for a full minute, to observe the positions on the boards. Her expression during these moments was thoughtful, analytical. her eyes moving with a pattern that suggested deep consideration rather than idle curiosity. But James had made her his project, a running joke that reinforced his status among the members. On Tuesday evening, he caught her watching a queen's gambit declined and announced loudly, "Still trying to understand how the horsey moves, are we?" His friends erupted in laughter. On Thursday, when Margaret paused near an endgame study, James made a show of approaching her. "Perhaps I should label the pieces for you. This one is the queen. She's the most powerful, rather like the ladies who marry into money, wouldn't you say?" More laughter, louder this time. Margaret took a deep, steadying breath, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on her mop handle before she continued working. By the second week, other members had joined in, emboldened by James's example. A portly businessman in his 50s made a comment about the Cleaning Ladies' Chess Academy. A younger member suggested they should charge her tuition for the free education she was receiving by watching them play. Each comment was met with chuckles and knowing glances. James, ever present at the center of it, would straighten his burgundy tie and add his own observations, each one more condescending than the last. "One must have a certain intellectual capacity for chess," he said one evening when Margaret was cleaning nearby. "It's not like mopping floors, where you simply repeat the same motion endlessly. Chess requires vision, strategy, the ability to think several steps ahead. These are gifts not everyone receives." Margaret heard it all, absorbed each cutting remark with the same dignified silence. She took deep breaths, centering herself, maintaining her composure even as the hostile environment grew more pronounced. Her face remained calm, almost serene, but anyone watching closely might have noticed the way her jaw set just slightly tighter, the way her movements became even more deliberate and controlled, like someone containing something powerful beneath a still surface. Friday evening brought a special social event to the Thornwood Chess Club, a monthly gathering where members played casual games, shared expensive whiskey, and networked with Manhattan's chess elite. The main hall was more crowded than usual, filled with the sound of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and the distinctive click of wooden pieces against marble boards. Margaret arrived for her shift to find the grand space buzzing with energy. Men and women in expensive evening wear clustered around tables, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. She began her work methodically, starting at the far corners and working her way through the room, her presence acknowledged by no one except Sarah Chen, who smiled at her from behind the refreshment table. James Hartford was in rare form that evening. He had spent the last 2 hours playing simultaneous games against 6 members, defeating them all with theatrical flair, and his ego had swelled to match the occasion. He stood at the center of the largest grouping, a glass of single malt in his hand, his burgundy tie perfectly knotted, his suit jacket draped over a nearby chair to reveal expensive suspenders. His voice carried across the hall with absolute confidence as he held forth on his favorite subject, the inherent superiority of those born to appreciate chess at its highest level. True chess, real championship-level chess, requires a combination of intelligence and education that common people simply don't possess, he declared, straightening his tie even though it needed no adjustment. It's not their fault, of course. They lack the breeding, the training, the intellectual foundation. You cannot teach someone to see 10 moves ahead if they lack the cognitive capacity. It's rather like expecting a laborer to appreciate opera or fine art. The appreciation requires cultivation that comes from a certain class, a certain upbringing. His admirers nodded sagely, murmuring agreement. One mentioned that chess had always been a gentleman's game, a pursuit of the educated elite. James smiled, pleased with the observation. Precisely. The board is a battlefield of minds, and not all minds are created equal. Some of us are simply born with superior pattern recognition, superior strategic thinking. It's genetics, really. You either have it or you don't. Margaret worked not 20 feet away, wiping down a recently vacated table, her movements measured and calm. She heard every word, felt every implication. But her face remained composed, her breathing steady and controlled. Her hands moved across the wooden surface with practiced efficiency, and if they trembled slightly, no one was close enough to notice. James set his whiskey glass down with a decisive click that drew attention. His eyes had been tracking Margaret as she worked, and an idea had formed in his mind. The kind of idea that seemed brilliant when fueled by alcohol and an audience hungry for entertainment. He raised his voice, addressing her directly for the first time. "You there, the cleaning lady? You're always watching our games. Tell me, do you even know how the pieces move?" The hall fell quiet, conversation stopping mid-sentence as heads turned toward Margaret. She straightened from her work, meeting his gaze with calm eyes. "I know a little about chess, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the sudden attention of 40 people focused on her. The crowd tittered with laughter. James's smile widened, and he straightened his burgundy tie with theatrical precision. An idea had fully formed now, and his audience was primed for a show. "A little. How charming." He turned to his admirers, his voice growing louder, more performative. "You know what? I think it's time we gave our dedicated janitor a proper education. She's been watching us for weeks now, clearly fascinated but utterly lost. It's almost cruel of us not to help her understand what she's witnessing." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone called out encouragement. James was warming to his theme now, playing to the room. "Yes, I'll give you a beginner's lesson right here, right now. Consider it charity, community service. We'll teach the janitor about chess so she can finally comprehend what she's been observing. Perhaps she can tell her friends that she once played against a national champion." The crowd was gathering now, drawn by the spectacle. Members abandoned their own games, drinks in hand, forming a loose circle around the central area. Several pulled out their phones, already recording, treating this as entertainment, a story to share later. James gestured grandly toward an empty table. Come, don't be shy. I'll teach you about the beautiful game, show you what people like you are missing when you watch people like us play. Consider it your lucky night." The mockery in his tone was unmistakable, the condescension dripping from every word. Margaret stood still for a moment, her cleaning supplies forgotten, and something flickered in her eyes that no one bothered to read. Then she took a deep, steadying breath and moved toward the table. James made an elaborate production of setting up the board at the central table, the largest and most visible in the entire hall, ensuring maximum audience for what he clearly considered entertainment rather than education. He positioned the pieces with exaggerated care, turning each one to face Margaret as if she needed visual aids to understand basic shapes. The crowd pressed closer, forming a tight circle around them, phones already out and recording, capturing every moment of what they expected to be a humiliating spectacle. James began his explanation in a tone dripping with condescension, speaking slowly and clearly as if addressing someone with limited comprehension. "Now, this tall piece with the cross on top is called the king. He moves one square in any direction. This one beside him, with the crown, is the queen. She is the most powerful piece on the board." He paused after each sentence, waiting as if expecting Margaret to struggle with the complexity. "These smaller pieces are pawns. They move forward one square, except on their first move when they can move 2 squares. You understand so far?" Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening quietly, her expression neutral and calm. She did not nod, did not respond, simply absorbed his patronizing lecture with the same dignity she had maintained throughout weeks of mockery. James continued, warming to his performance. "You see, chess is a game for people with education, with training. People like you, in your position, probably have never had the opportunity to develop these kinds of strategic thinking skills. It requires a certain intellectual capacity that comes from privilege, from good schools, from the right upbringing." The phrases landed like small cruelties, deliberate and cutting, and several members shifted uncomfortably. Sarah Chen stood near the refreshment table, her face tight with discomfort, but she said nothing. Too junior to challenge the national champion, too aware of her own tenuous position. James gestured magnanimously at the board. "I will let you play white, since you need every advantage you can get. White moves first, you see, which is considered slightly beneficial, though I assure you, it will make no difference in the outcome. The humiliation was public and deliberate, performed for the cameras and the crowd, and Margaret simply inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the gesture without dignity lost or pride wounded, waiting patiently for him to finish his show so the actual game could begin. Margaret settled into the leather chair across from James, her gray uniform stark against the rich mahogany and polished brass of the club's furnishings. The crowd pressed closer, phones held high to capture what they expected to be a humiliating display of ignorance. James made an elaborate show of setting up the pieces, explaining each one's name and movement pattern in a voice dripping with condescension, as if speaking to a child. Margaret listened without comment, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. When James finally finished his patronizing tutorial and gestured for her to begin, Margaret reached for her king's pawn. Her hands, though weathered from years of work, calloused and marked by labor, moved to the piece with unexpected grace, her fingers finding it with the kind of precision that spoke of deep familiarity. She lifted it and placed it on the fourth rank with a gentle but firm motion, the piece settling into place with a soft click. "King's pawn to e4, she said quietly. James's smirk widened into something approaching delight. He turned to his audience, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. King's pawn opening. How predictable. How utterly basic. This is what beginners always play because they've heard it's good but don't understand why. No creativity, no originality, just mimicking what they've seen without comprehension. He barely glanced at the board as he moved his own king's pawn forward to meet hers. This is called the open game, though of course you wouldn't know that. It's the first thing children learn. Quite appropriate, really. The crowd chuckled appreciatively, enjoying the show. James leaned back in his chair, not even bothering to study the position, his confidence absolute. Margaret said nothing in response to his commentary. Her expression remained serene, almost meditative, her entire focus directed at the 64 squares before her. While James performed for the cameras and the crowd, making jokes about teaching fundamentals to the help, Margaret's eyes moved across the board with quiet intensity. Her breathing was steady, her posture upright, despite the long day of physical labor. The crowd watched with amused condescension, expecting this to be over quickly, a brief entertainment before returning to their drinks and their own games. None of them noticed the quality of her stillness, the depth of her concentration, the way her eyes saw not just the pieces, but the spaces between them, the potential energy waiting to be released. The game progressed move by move, Margaret playing with deliberate slowness, taking her time to consider each position, while James moved quickly, almost carelessly, his attention divided between the board and his running commentary for the audience. "You see how I'm controlling the center," he explained after his fifth move, gesturing at the board without really studying it. "This is basic strategic principle. Control the center, develop your pieces quickly, castle early. I'm giving her every advantage, playing straightforward lines so she can follow along, and she's still struggling to find decent moves." He shook his head with mock sympathy. "This knight development is quite weak, I'm afraid. Textbook beginner mistake." The crowd murmured appreciatively, phones still recording, everyone enjoying the spectacle of the national champion educating the janitor. Margaret said nothing, simply moving her pieces with the same methodical precision, her face a mask of calm concentration. By the eighth move, she had developed her knights and bishops, her king safely castled, her position compact and solid. James continued his lecture, barely glancing at the board before making his moves, explaining each decision as if teaching a masterclass to someone who could barely understand checkers. But on the 10th move, something changed. Mr. Williamson, a 73-year-old retired attorney who had been a club member for 4 decades and carried a respectable master rating, pushed through the crowd to get a closer look at the board. His eyes narrowed as he studied the position, his head tilting slightly as if he had seen something unexpected. Margaret's pieces were coordinated in a way that seemed almost too purposeful. Her pawn structure sound, her minor pieces occupying strong squares that controlled key diagonals and files. This was not the random flailing of a beginner. This was deliberate, principled chess. Mr. Williamson's expression shifted from amusement to puzzlement, and he leaned in even closer, his practiced eye recognizing patterns that the crowd, focused on entertainment rather than analysis, had missed. James made his 11th move and launched into another explanation, but his voice carried less certainty now. He had actually looked at the board this time, really looked, and his smile faltered just slightly. The position required thought, actual calculation. His hand hovered over his pieces for a moment longer than before, and the crowd sensed the shift even if they did not understand it. By move 15, the atmosphere in the main hall had shifted like weather changing before a storm. The amused laughter had given way to murmurs, uncertain whispers passing between members as they watched the board with growing confusion. Margaret had just played her bishop to a square that created a subtle threat against James's queenside, a move that looked quiet but carried implications that rippled across the position like stones dropped in still water. Several of the stronger players in the crowd leaned forward, studying the board with furrowed brows, recognizing patterns that should not have been there, strategies that spoke of deep understanding rather than beginner's luck. James had stopped commentating entirely. The theatrical explanations had died in his throat around move 12, replaced by intense focus on the 64 squares before him. His hand moved to his burgundy tie repeatedly, adjusting it with sharp, nervous movements that contrasted sharply with his earlier confidence. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead despite the club's perfect climate control, and his eyes darted across the board, calculating variations, seeing problems in his position that should not have existed against a cleaning woman who supposedly knew only a little about chess. Margaret remained exactly as she had been, calm and centered, her weathered hands moving to each piece with unwavering precision. Every move was purposeful, economical, the mark of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. She did not rush, did not hesitate with false uncertainty, simply played chess the way a master craftsman works wood, with tools long familiar and skills deeply ingrained. Mr. Williamson turned to Arthur Chen, another senior member standing beside him, and whispered urgently, "This isn't beginner's play, Arthur. Look at her pawn structure. The way she's coordinating her pieces. This is sophisticated positional chess. Where did she learn to play like this?" Arthur studied the board, his eyes widening as he recognized what Mr. Williamson meant. The murmurs grew louder, more animated. Members pulled out chess apps on their phones, entering the position to analyze it, their expressions shifting from amusement to bewilderment. Near the refreshment table, Sarah Chen had abandoned her duties entirely, watching with her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes moving between Margaret's serene face and James's increasingly stressed expression. The recording phones remained raised, but the tone had changed completely. This was no longer entertainment. This was something else entirely. Something none of them had expected, and the realization was spreading through the crowd like electricity. James abandoned strategy in favor of aggression, launching a desperate attack against Margaret's kingside with the kind of tactics that were meant to overwhelm and confuse weaker players. He pushed his pawns forward recklessly, sacrificed a knight for what he hoped would be a mating attack, and moved his queen aggressively into enemy territory, trying to create chaos on the board that would expose Margaret's supposed lack of experience. But Margaret met each thrust with elegant precision, her pieces flowing across the board like water finding channels in rock, deflecting his attacks with moves that looked simple but carried profound defensive strength. Her rook swung to the perfect file, cutting off his queen's escape route. Her knight repositioned to a square that simultaneously defended her king and attacked his exposed bishop. Every move was economy itself. No wasted motion, no panic, just pure chess understanding that made James's aggressive attempts look crude by comparison. The main hall had grown eerily quiet, the earlier laughter and commentary replaced by hushed concentration. Members were no longer recording to mock, but to document, pulling out their phones to photograph the position, to run analysis engines, to capture something they sensed was historically significant. A woman in an evening gown, herself a candidate master, entered the position into her chess app and watched the evaluation bar with widening eyes. The engine says her position is significantly better, she whispered to the man beside her. She's not just defending, she's winning. An international master who had been watching from the periphery pushed closer to the board. His face was pale as he studied Margaret's last 3 moves in sequence. This reminds me of Capablanca, he said, his voice carrying in the silence. That same effortless simplicity, the way she's making the complex look elementary. I've seen this style in legendary Grandmaster games. James heard the comment, and his face, already flushed with concentration, went a shade paler. His confident expression had cracked completely, replaced by intense focus edged with growing concern. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his bishop, reconsidered, pulled back, then finally moved his rook, with a motion that lacked all his earlier certainty. Sweat now ran freely down his temple, and his burgundy tie hung slightly askew, forgotten in his concentration. He was playing for his reputation now, and he knew it. Move 25! Margaret's hand moved to her bishop, sliding it across the diagonal with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the game. The piece settled on a square that looked innocuous, almost passive, but James's eyes widened as he followed the implications. Before he could fully process it, Margaret's hand was already moving again, her knight lifting and repositing to a square that suddenly transformed the entire position. The combination unfolded like a flower blooming in accelerated time. Beautiful and inevitable. Her rook swung across the back rank, and James saw it all at once, the entire devastating sequence he had missed completely. His queen was trapped, every escape square-controlled, every defensive resource exhausted. The combination had been building for 3 moves, hidden in plain sight, and he had walked into it like a child stumbling into quicksand. The crowd gasped collectively, a sharp intake of breath from 40 people, simultaneously recognizing the brilliance of what they had just witnessed. James stared at the board in utter disbelief, his mouth slightly open, his hands frozen above the pieces. He replayed the sequence in his mind, tracing back the moves, trying to find where he could have prevented it. But there was nothing. She had constructed a trap so elegant, so perfectly concealed, that he had never seen it coming despite his years of training and his national championship title. His face flushed deep red, the color spreading from his collar to his hairline, and his hands began to shake. Margaret's voice cut through the stunned silence, quiet and calm as still water. "I believe that's check, Mr. Hartford." The formality of her words, the gentleness of her tone, somehow made the devastation more complete. She had not gloated, had not mocked, had simply stated the fact with the same dignity she had maintained throughout his weeks of cruel commentary. Members crowded closer now, pressing in to see the position, to verify what they had witnessed. Phones flashed as people photographed the board, capturing the moment for posterity. The murmurs grew louder, excited, amazed. Mr. Williamson had pulled out his phone, his fingers moving frantically across the screen, searching for something with sudden, urgent intensity. His face had gone pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he typed, as if a terrible suspicion had just crystallized into certainty, and he needed to confirm what his instincts were screaming at him. James sacrificed his queen for 2 pieces, trying desperately to salvage something from the wreckage, but it was like throwing buckets of water at a forest fire. The position was lost, fundamentally and irretrievably lost, and Margaret's play became even more precise now, methodical and surgical, like a master craftsman finishing a delicate piece of work. Each move tightened the noose around his king, restricting squares, cutting off escape routes, marching her passed pawns forward with inexorable patience. She was not rushing to finish him, not gloating or playing quickly to humiliate him further, but simply executing the win with the kind of technical precision that spoke of thousands of endgames played and mastered. James's moves became desperate, random almost, the flailing of a drowning man, and the crowd watched in absolute silence as the national champion was systematically dismantled by a woman in a janitor's uniform. "Mr. Williamson suddenly exclaimed, his voice cracking with shock. My God, I knew I recognized that style." His phone screen glowed in his shaking hands, and he held it up to the members nearest him, his face pale as parchment. Look at this." The photograph on his screen showed a younger woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with the same sharp eyes and calm expression as Margaret. She stood on a tournament stage holding an enormous crystal trophy, surrounded by photographers and officials, wearing an elegant suit rather than a gray uniform. The caption beneath read, "Margaret Hayes wins U.S. Women's Championship for 5th time." Members crowded around Mr. Williamson's phone, their faces transforming from confusion to shock as they passed the device between them, comparing the photograph to the woman sitting calmly at the chessboard. "Margaret Hayes," Mr. Williamson said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "International Grandmaster. 5-time national women's champion. She was ranked in the top 50 players in the world, competed in candidates tournaments, played against Judith Polgár and C.A. Jun. She disappeared from competitive chess 24 years ago." He looked at Margaret with something like awe mixed with shame. "We've had a legend cleaning our floors, and we never knew. We never even bothered to ask." The crowd erupted in whispers, excited and horrified in equal measure. Phones were pulled out frantically, members searching her name, finding articles and game databases, tournament records and accolades. James sat frozen at the board, staring not at the pieces now but at Margaret's face, and the blood drained from his cheeks as the full weight of what he had done crashed down upon him. The news rippled through the crowd like shock waves, members pulling up article after article on their phones, reading aloud in hushed, amazed voices. Margaret Hayes, International Grandmaster, highest title in chess below World Champion. 5-time United States Women's Champion in consecutive years from 1996 to 2000, semi-finalist in the Women's World Championship in 1998. Known for her positional mastery and endgame technique, compared favorably to the greatest female players of her generation. But then the article stopped, the tournament records ending abruptly in 2001. Members dug deeper, finding a brief obituary that explained everything. David Hayes, software engineer, had died suddenly of an aneurysm, leaving behind his wife Margaret and their 3-year-old daughter Emily. After that, Margaret Hayes vanished from the chess world completely. No tournaments, no exhibitions, no guest appearances. One article from a chess magazine written 5 years later speculated about her disappearance, calling it one of the great mysteries of American chess, a player in her prime who simply walked away. The crowd stared at Margaret with new eyes, seeing not a janitor but a giant of the game, someone whose brilliance had graced championship stages around the world. The shame was palpable, thick in the air like smoke. They had mocked her, laughed at her, treated her as invisible and beneath notice, and she had been capable of defeating any of them with ease. James looked at the photograph on Mr. Williamson's phone, then at Margaret sitting calmly across from him, and his face drained of all color until he looked almost gray. His hands trembled violently, and his mouth opened and closed without sound, trying to form words that would not come. The magnitude of his cruelty, his weeks of condescension and mockery directed at a chess legend, crushed down on him with unbearable weight. The game continued. Margaret moved her rook to the 7th rank, and her voice remained gentle and steady. "Your move, Mr. Hartford." But James could barely see the board through the horror of his realization, could barely think through the roaring shame in his ears. The recording phones captured everything, his humiliation now complete and permanent, broadcast to a crowd that would ensure this story spread far beyond the walls of the Thornwood Chess Club. Margaret's queen moved diagonally across the board, settling on a square that ended everything. The white king had nowhere to go, trapped by its own pieces and the elegant net Margaret had woven around it. "Checkmate," she said quietly, her voice carrying no triumph, no vindication, just a simple statement of fact. She looked up at James with eyes that held no cruelty, no desire to hurt him further, and extended her work-worn hand across the board. "Good game, Mr. Hartford." James sat frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, humiliated before the very crowd he had been showing off to just an hour earlier. The recording phones captured everything, dozens of them. The national champion defeated by the janitor, his arrogance turned to ashes, his cruelty reflected back at him in the most devastating way possible. Tears formed in his eyes, and he could not bring himself to take her hand, could not even look at her face. The silence in the hall was absolute, 40 people holding their breath, witnessing something that would be told and retold in chess circles for years to come. Mr. Williamson approached the table, his elderly face creased with shame and regret. "Mrs. Hayes, I must apologize. I've been a member here for 40 years, and I should have recognized you. I saw you play in Philadelphia in 1999, watched you defeat Irina Krush in a game that was absolutely brilliant. I am so deeply sorry that we treated you with such disrespect that we never bothered to see who you really were." Margaret finally withdrew her extended hand when it became clear James could not take it, and she turned to Mr. Williamson with a gentle expression. "You have nothing to apologize for, Mr. Williamson. I chose this life, this quiet existence. I prefer it. Actually, after my husband died, I needed to step away from the pressure, from the competition. I needed to raise my daughter without the constant travel and stress. Chess became something I loved again once I wasn't performing it, just observing it quietly." Her voice was warm, without bitterness, and the grace of her response somehow made the crowd's shame even more acute. At that moment, the elevator doors opened and Edward Preston, the club owner, strode into the hall. Sarah Chen had called him immediately when the situation began to unfold, and his face was stern as he took in the scene. The crowd gathered around the board, the phones recording, and James Hartford sitting pale and shaking in his chair. Edward Preston was a man who commanded respect without raising his voice, and the crowd parted silently as he walked to the center table where Margaret and James sat. He was 67 years old, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed, and he had built the Thornwood Chess Club into one of the most prestigious institutions in American chess over 30 years of careful stewardship. His expression as he surveyed the scene was grave, disappointed, the look of a man who had witnessed something deeply troubling in a place he had worked hard to make honorable. "I have been informed of what transpired here this evening," he said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "And I am profoundly disturbed." He turned to address the entire room, making eye contact with members who could not hold his gaze. "This club was founded on certain values: respect, dignity, and the principle that merit at the chessboard transcends all other considerations. We have betrayed those values tonight. We have allowed cruelty and mockery to flourish in these halls, and we have collectively failed to see the humanity and worth of someone working among us." His eyes settled on James, who seemed to shrink in his chair. "Mr. Hartford, your behavior has been unacceptable. You have brought shame to your title and to this institution." James opened his mouth, but no words came out, and Mr. Preston turned to Margaret with an expression that mixed respect and deep regret. "Mrs. Hayes, I owe you an apology on behalf of the Thornwood Chess Club. What you have endured here is inexcusable." Margaret shook her head gently, rising from her chair with quiet dignity. "Mr. Preston, I chose this work deliberately. After my daughter Emily started medical school at Columbia 3 years ago, I found myself with an empty apartment and time on my hands. I needed work, honest work with evening hours that would let me feel useful again. I had been away from chess professionally for so long, and taking this position allowed me to be near the game without the pressure of competition or recognition. I found peace in watching others play, in seeing the beauty of chess without needing to prove anything anymore." Her voice was steady, sincere, without a trace of self-pity. "I never sought recognition because I did not want it. The game is enough for me now, just the game itself." The members listened with collective shame etched on their faces, understanding fully now what they had done. How they had treated greatness with contempt simply because it came dressed in a janitor's uniform. James finally found his voice, though it came out broken and shaking. He stood from his chair, his legs unsteady, and faced Margaret directly for the first time, with clear eyes rather than the fog of arrogance. "Mrs. Hayes, I cannot." His voice cracked, and he had to stop, composing himself. "There are no words sufficient for what I have done. I have been cruel. inexcusably cruel, to someone who deserved only respect. I mocked you, belittled you, made you the subject of weeks of humiliation. And you, he gestured helplessly at the board, you could have destroyed me in the first 5 moves if you had wanted to. You could have humiliated me immediately, but you played with patience and grace even when I deserved none. Tears ran freely down his face now, his expensive suit and championship title meaning nothing in the face of his shame. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful and calm. When James finished, unable to continue, she spoke with the same gentleness she had shown throughout. Mr. Hartford, you have tremendous talent. I saw it in your play despite everything else. Your tactical vision is exceptional. Your calculation speed impressive. You could be truly great. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. But talent without humility is dangerous, to yourself and to others. True mastery requires more than seeing patterns on a board. It requires respect for everyone you encounter, recognition that worth is not determined by title or uniform or social position. Every person you meet knows something you do not, has value you cannot immediately see. The moment you forget that, the moment you believe your gifts make you superior to others as human beings, you stop growing. You become small, even as you win tournaments. James absorbed her words like blows, each one landing with the weight of truth. He nodded, unable to speak. Margaret's voice softened further. I saw your potential in your play tonight, but I also saw your weakness. Not in your chess, but in your arrogance. You assumed, you dismissed, you never asked. That is the lesson here. She paused, then added quietly, when you have learned this lesson, truly learned it, perhaps we can play again. I would enjoy that. James broke down completely then, his shoulders shaking with genuine remorse, and the crowd watched in absolute silence as a champion was humbled and, perhaps, remade. Mr. Preston stepped forward, his expression resolute. Mrs. Hayes, the Thornwood Chess Club would be honored if you would accept a full membership, with all fees waived permanently. Beyond that, I would like to offer you the position of resident coach and instructor. Your knowledge and grace would be invaluable to our members, and frankly, we need your influence to remember what truly matters in this game and in life. The offer was genuine, generous, but Margaret shook her head gently. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Preston, truly. But I enjoy my work. It gives me purpose, keeps me grounded, and allows me to be near chess without the obligations of formal instruction. However, I would be willing to teach occasionally, perhaps one evening per week, working with members who genuinely wish to learn not just chess, but the values that make it beautiful. Mr. Preston nodded, understanding, and turned to address the room once more. Sarah Chen, would you please come here? Sarah approached nervously, and Mr. Preston smiled at her warmly. You have consistently shown respect and kindness to everyone in this club, regardless of their position. That is leadership. Effective immediately, you are promoted to assistant manager with a substantial increase in compensation. We need more people like you in positions of influence. Sarah's eyes widened with shock and gratitude, and she glanced at Margaret, who smiled back with genuine warmth. Mr. Preston's expression grew stern again as he turned to James. Mr. Hartford, you are suspended from all club-sponsored competitions for 6 months. However, I am offering you a path to redemption. You will spend those 6 months teaching chess to underprivileged children at community centers throughout the city without compensation, learning humility through service. If you complete this requirement with genuine commitment, you may return. James nodded immediately, accepting the consequence without protest, his face still streaked with tears. I will, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. Mr. Preston addressed the entire membership. Effective immediately. This club will implement new policies regarding respect and dignity. Every person who enters these doors, regardless of their role, deserves courtesy and consideration. We will train all members on these expectations, and violations will result in permanent expulsion. The game of chess teaches us to look beyond the obvious, to see deeply, to value the hidden potential in every position. We must apply those same principles to how we treat one another. The video spread like wildfire through the chess world, shared first by members who had witnessed it, then picked up by chess forums, social media platforms, and eventually mainstream news outlets. Within 72 hours, millions of people had watched the national champion being defeated by a janitor. But more importantly, they had heard the story behind it. Margaret Hayes, the disappeared Grandmaster, working quietly in the shadows of the very world she had once dominated, treated with contempt until her brilliance could no longer be ignored. Chess federations from around the world reached out, offering exhibitions, honorary positions, speaking engagements. The United States Chess Federation wanted to induct her into their Hall of Fame. International chess organizations invited her to major tournaments as a guest of honor. But Margaret declined almost everything, granting only one interview to a respected chess journalist who promised to let her control the narrative. In that interview, watched by hundreds of thousands, Margaret spoke not about chess, but about class, dignity, and true values. She discussed how society trains people to judge worth by job titles, by clothing, by superficial markers of success, and how that training blinds us to the humanity and value in everyone we meet. She emphasized that her worth as a person was not diminished by pushing a mop, just as it had not been elevated by winning championships. Work had dignity regardless of its nature, and every person deserved respect regardless of their position. The interview resonated far beyond the chess community, touching people in service industries, manual laborers, anyone who had ever felt invisible or dismissed. Meanwhile, James Hartford began his 6 months of community service teaching chess to children in underprivileged neighborhoods across New York City. He arrived each day in simple clothes rather than expensive suits, sitting on plastic chairs in church basements and community centers, teaching children who could not afford club memberships or private lessons. The work transformed him slowly. The humility learned not through punishment, but through connection with students who saw chess as escape and opportunity. Other Thornwood members who had participated in the mockery became advocates for change, speaking publicly about their shame and working to ensure such treatment never happened again at any chess institution. The story became a parable, shared and discussed, a reminder that brilliance and worth exist everywhere, often in the places we least expect to find them. 6 months passed, and the Thornwood Chess Club had become a different place. Its marble halls filled with a warmth that had been absent before. James Hartford returned from his suspension transformed, no longer the arrogant prodigy who had mocked a janitor, but a humbled man with purpose burning in his eyes. His time teaching children in community centers had stripped away the veneer of superiority, replacing it with genuine understanding that chess was not about proving dominance, but sharing beauty. He and Margaret played occasionally now, quiet games in the corner of the club after hours, and while he still lost more often than he won, he was learning lessons far more valuable than tactics and strategy. She taught him to see people, really see them, to recognize that every person carried stories and wisdom that title and status could never reveal. The club itself had changed, implementing the policies Mr. Preston had promised, becoming more welcoming and diverse, a place where respect was expected and enforced. New members came from different backgrounds, and the old guard, chastened by their collective shame, worked actively to create an environment of inclusion. Margaret still worked as the evening janitor by choice, finding purpose in the honest labor and the occasional teaching sessions where she shared not just chess knowledge but life wisdom with students who listened with genuine reverence. She had turned down every offer to return to competitive chess, content with her quiet existence. Her daughter Emily, now in her final year of medical school, the sacrifice and hard work of those years vindicated. The story of that night had become legend, a reminder that spread far beyond chess, teaching a lesson the world desperately needed to learn. Never judge by appearances, for the person you dismiss might possess greatness you cannot imagine. Everyone has a story, everyone has value, and true greatness is measured not by credentials or championships, but by character, by how you treat those you believe have nothing to offer you. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed because of how you looked or what job you held, share your story. Let others know they are not alone. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to see people rather than positions, to value character over status, then carry that lesson forward into every interaction. Remember Margaret Hayes, who found more dignity in pushing a mop with grace than most people find in a lifetime of accolades. And let her example inspire you to look deeper, to judge slower, to recognize that worth exists everywhere, waiting only for eyes wise enough to see it.